But I think the other thing about what I would call the Magdalenian tradition, and this is where I think it becomes much easier to hold on to something as a thread, is if you look at the lives and the devotions and the writings of certain mystics, what you find throughout is a thread that you can follow. And this thread, if we look at both the actual textual writings, so for example, Julian of Norwich, in the beginning of Revelations of Divine Love, she talks about how she had wanted to have a sense of unity with God and longing to have the sense of unity with Jesus. And her first prayer is to walk in the footsteps of Mary Magdalene. That's what she begins the Revelations of Divine Love, is she wanted to be there. And there was a whole contemplative tradition of imagining yourself in Mary Magdalene's footsteps, which would have been accompanying Christ to the cross and being present there for suffering and to give of your love and of your heart. So regardless of whether it's the canonical accepted Catholic tradition or more heretical versions, or even Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther himself, Mary Magdalene was associated with the path of the heart, path of love, the path of uniting your spirit in both suffering and in joy, of being the faithful witness, of being the apostle to the apostles, of being maestra of apostolorum, as it says in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, in that glorious Gothic church. There is a painting of her holding this book that says Maestra Apostolorum, or the maestra, the teacher of the apostles. And so we have enough of these little puzzle pieces that we can put together these threads: heart-centered devotion, contemplation, that she's known as the contemplative disciple, faithful witness to both death and life, and the one who is told to go forth and to proclaim. And that's a pretty significant image. If you just take those ingredients, and that for me feels like we can say this about her with confidence and assurance by wedding together biblical scholarship, historical tradition, mystic tradition, plus the new information that we have from Egypt. They all agree on these elements. And that is an archetype we desperately need right now. A heart-centered, courageous disciple, able to be present for suffering and sorrow, but also proclaim joy, new life, and hope. And that's why I think she's the apostle for our times.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful and wonderful. Thank you. It gives me 100 questions. The first one, if I can, I'd like to revisit the idea of her as the repentant prostitute.
Yeah.
Because I understand how that could have been used to shame her in the past because of patriarchal ideas and stuff like that. But I have to admit, I really love the image of her as...
people love that. That's why it's been so hard to dispel this.
yeah, the image of her as a sex worker, because for one thing, she was, the apostle to the apostles. She was the one who really got the contemplative tradition. And so for me, it's a big thing for Jesus to say, this woman who's a sex worker, that the world, he's taking the person the world craps on the most, and the person, the thing that you always hear feminists saying, as a critique of people who are against sex workers, they say, well, you demand their services and then you tell them that they're garbage. And that's really unfair. And Jesus shows up, if we were to assume that she was such, and says, well, here's this woman who's a sex worker, and you know what, she's brilliant and inspired and amazing, and I'm going to make her my favorite disciple, who I'm going to give all my best secrets to.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to admit that I love that.
No, it's a very compelling image. There's just nothing in the Bible that would support that.
Right. Okay.
There's nothing in that, and there's nothing in Nag Hammadi that would support that at all. Okay. But it's an incredibly compelling image, and I would say that from what we know of this pretty radical Jewish rabbi, it's certainly not antithetical to who he was. It's always the least shall be greatest. I mean, it is consonant with a philosophy that I don't think it could have. I think that knowing from what I know of Jesus, that could have been the case. It's just, I don't happen to be persuaded in any way at all that that was the case, if that makes sense.
It does make
But
sense.
I want to point to a couple of other interesting traditions. There's one tradition um, that comes through a variant of what they call French Gnosticism from a scholar named Tal Malachi. And in one of his books, he talks about a tradition that he's familiar with, in which Mary Magdalene was actually en route, I think he says, to be married, and waylaid by bandits and sold into sexual slavery and raped. And there's this one whole tradition. And again, it's an incredibly compelling, beautiful story. If we imagine, a young woman of noble birth, and then she is abducted, raped, sold into slavery, and then murders her captors. And that this tradition is where she encounters Jesus, and that it's his teachings that heal her and make her whole and take away the rage and anger and bitterness in her heart. And I think it's an incredibly beautiful story. And again, I always think about, Joseph Campbell, who said, of course it's true, even if none of it happened, that there's an element of, yeah, there's something profoundly authentic that is a possibility in human experience, for sure.
Yeah.
We have so many amazing conversion stories that we know of are historical, of people doing a complete metanoia from one way of life and revealing themselves after a spiritual encounter. Of course, it's in the realm of the possible, but historically, there is absolutely nothing in Nag Hammadi, absolutely nothing in the Bible that would do that. And what most feminist scholars believe is true, and not just feminist scholars, but most scholars, I would say, who are working in this field deeply, is that they point to especially the 6th century, as the time where Mary Magdalene's image was remade. And after the first few centuries of Christianity, which were remarkably egalitarian, we have these communities, of men and women preaching and teaching together. We have this sense of a whole new world that had been ushered in by Jesus, in which women are elevated to a power that they had not known in the Roman Empire. And that as Christianity becomes Romanized, rather than that being brought to the world, it becomes suppressed. And so women get cut out of the picture. They get rewritten. Their names get gender changes, in the Bible. We have this reduction. And so many people have wondered, well, if the fact that Mary Magdalene was the first witness, the most loyal disciple, what would be the most expedient way to undercut women's role in the church? Well, it's by putting sexual scandal upon them. So we've seen this in politics, we've seen this in played out through history over and over and over again. So the conflation starts to happen in the 6th century, and then it runs wild in the succeeding centuries. And there's a new image. And rather than Mary Magdalene being the strong, spiritually empowered, courageous witness and leader, she becomes this penitent prostitute. And it was the easiest way to make her small. And so she gets small, and the Virgin Mary, whose virginity then becomes lifelong and unquestionable, she's the one who gets elevated. And as so many women have said, they said, I could never aspire to being the Virgin Mary. So what was there for me? So we have, psychologically, we have the splitting of the feminine archetype, virgin and whore. And that's it, and where is there the courageous, loyal, insightful, brilliant, spiritual maestra? She's gone.
Yeah, and that's so true, because Mother Mary, as much as I love her, isn't that brilliant, insightful person.
No,
She's
yeah.
virtuous because she's chaste and she's pure and humble and simple, which are good qualities, but are not the disciple of the apostle to the apostles. It's not the one who gets it the most.
Exactly. It's a very different thing. Although I have to say that I'm falling more and more in love with the Virgin Mary too.
I love her. She's great.
Because I think she's also had there's this thing that can happen of either demonizing or glorifying. And I think we've whitewashed Mary. We really have whitewashed Jesus's mother, because if you actually look, like, what did it take? We have all these hymns that we sing growing up in church of Mother Mary, meek and mild. But if you actually look at the Magnificat, that is not a meek and mild statement. That is a radical cry for social justice and upheaval. And if you think about, what did it take for a pregnant teenager to say yes? One of the things that I love about the medieval tradition is that they have this legend that Gabriel went for centuries asking if someone, because it requires consent, right? It's not like, in the Greek myth, Zeus comes as a swan and rapes the young virgin, and she doesn't have a choice. The Christian narrative is that she had to say yes, she had to agree. But I love this medieval tradition that Gabriel knocked on the doors for centuries. But what he said is, not only will you be having the redemption, not only through your body will come the redemption of the world, but it will be agonizing. And that he presents the 7 sorrows at the same time. It's like, you will give birth, but you will also watch your child die an ignominious death of pain and suffering as a common criminal. How do you sign up for that one? And even if we just take the pregnancy itself, to say yes to being an unwed pregnant teenager when such an event would have gotten you stoned to death in your culture, what did that take? So we need to reclaim, I think we've bleached out the wild fierceness of both of these women. We've reduced one to a penitent, weeping prostitute who's just like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so bad. And we've elevated the other one as this untouchable, always serene, never cry. I mean, you see those images of the Pietà, and they're gorgeous, but she's never upset. And if you think of what is the actual heart of a woman that's watching these suffering, what courage it takes for both of them to say yes to showing up over and over and over again, for scandal, for death, for birth, for life. These are fiercely courageous, brave women who we have either put in the gutter or elevated on a pedestal, neither of whom really honors who they were. Sorry, I get really passionate about this.
No, don't be sorry about that. That's exactly the right kind of thing to be, is passionate about it. And thank you for answering that. That helps, that frames it a lot, because I almost felt like saying that sort of rejecting the idea of Mary Magdalene as the repentant prostitute was sort of unfair to sex workers from a modern perspective, where it's like, I don't want to say, no, Mary Magdalene was too good to be a prostitute, because I don't want to say that. But of course, that wasn't the medieval way of looking at it. And when you talk about the splitting of the archetypes of the whore and the virgin, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. That's exactly.
What's so interesting is there is a figure who was a real life penitent prostitute, and she is also a Saint Mary, and Saint Mary of Egypt was a 4th century woman who was a wild sex worker, and she sold herself everywhere. And it wasn't just for income. She actually liked it, according to the hagiographies. She was exultant in her flesh. And according to those stories of the 4th century, then she has this massive conversion experience, and she goes off to the desert to become a hermit, and she becomes a holy woman. So we have that within our canonical tradition. I mean, it's there, especially in the Eastern Orthodox version of Saint Mary of Egypt. But 2 centuries later, it's like, it just became like everybody named Mary got put in the same basket, Mary of Bethany, Mary Salome, Mary Jochebed, Mary of Egypt. We'll just throw them all together and shake and make a cocktail. And here we go. Here's the new Mary Magdalene. And it just really takes away from the authentic intellectual, spiritual leader who was present at the very beginning, who we desperately need to reclaim.
Yeah, not because Mary couldn't have been that and a sex worker, but just because her being a sex worker was used to distract from what she.
Exactly. And I have to say, I'm encountering the other side of this a lot, because in the modern new age, one of the things that has appealed to so many people about Mary Magdalene is she's become a tantric goddess. There are all kinds of books out there about sex magic and Mary Magdalene, and channeled writings, and novels upon novels upon novels that are really focused on the sexual union that they are imagining between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And while in this case, sexuality has held in a very positive way, that still denies who she is in the canonical texts and in the Nag Hammadis. And I've encountered many people who become obsessed with the idea of Mary Magdalene as like, we're going to reclaim her as a tantric love goddess. But there's nothing in either text that really supports that either. Even the one that they hold up, the Gospel of Philip, they say, well, it says that Jesus kissed her on her mouth, but it doesn't actually say that. It says he kissed her on ... and it could have been her forehead or on her hand. And it's not the point. And there's a whole monastic tradition of kissing one another anyway.
That's the thing. Even if he did kiss her on the mouth, he kissed everybody on the mouth. That's the kiss of people.
Yeah, it doesn't match up. It's not proof positive, you know. And then there was something that was uncovered a few years ago, the scandalizing Jesus's wife papyrus scrap, but that's been proved to be a fraud. So people are desperately clinging to this idea, and what it points to me, frankly, because in my mind, you know, la baume, another meaning for baume is balm or healing. And one of the symbols that we have from Mary Magdalene that comes from the canonical text is that she comes with a jar of healing, right? I mean, that is the jar of healing. She embalms, she's there at the tomb to embalm Jesus. And that idea of balm and healing, to get back to, you know, Jesus as doctor, and well, Mary Magdalene as physician's assistant, if you will, or nurse. You know, one of the deepest wounds that we have in our world that's, I'm afraid, gotten much worse because of Christianity has to do with sexuality. And we are so desperately in need of healing around this. The elements that are woven throughout so many cultures of sexuality and shame is so deeply entrenched, whether you're a man or a woman. There's just so much. And we have, you know, if we look at current headlines just of the past 10 years, the number of sexual scandals within the church is heartbreaking. And the things that were called the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, nothing but heartbreaking. And so we need healing in this. But I don't think that the healing happens by turning her from a penitent prostitute into a tantric love goddess. I think that her coming in these ways to speak to people's deepest needs is a mirror for the healing that we need to do, not an affirmation of who she was historically.
But you're on fire. This is all awesome. Thank you.
Sure.